The blood-red sun was setting over the harsh Wyoming territory as Penelope Miller clutched her stomach on the porch of her family's homestead, the echo of her father's final words still ringing in her ears. "No daughter of mine will bring shame upon this household. You made your bed with that drifter. Now you can lie in it somewhere else." The year was 1878, and Penelope, or Penny as most called her, found herself utterly alone at 20 years of age, 3 months with child and without a penny to her name. The father of her baby, a smooth-talking gambler passing through town, had disappeared weeks ago, leaving nothing but empty promises and a growing life inside her. Tears streamed down her face as she gathered her meager belongings into a small cloth satchel. Her mother had slipped her a few coins and a loaf of bread when father wasn't looking, but it wouldn't last long. The autumn wind whipped through her woolen shawl as if to emphasize her vulnerability. "God help me," she whispered, one hand protectively over her slightly swollen abdomen. "What am I to do now?" Penny had never been beyond the boundaries of Silver Creek, the small mining town where she'd spent her entire life. Her father, the town's most prominent merchant, had always kept a tight leash on his only daughter. Now, cast out like yesterday's trash, the vastness of the frontier terrified her almost as much as the thought of bringing a child into the world alone. With nowhere else to turn, she began walking toward the outskirts of town. Night was falling quickly, and she needed shelter. The only place she could think to go was the old Donovan ranch about 4 miles outside of town. Mr. Donovan had passed last winter, and rumor had it his son had returned from somewhere out west to take over the property. She'd never met the younger Donovan, but desperation left her few options. The journey felt endless. Her riding boots, not meant for such walking, had rubbed blisters on her heels by the time the ranch house came into view. It was a modest structure, but well-maintained, with smoke curling from the chimney and a warm glow emanating from the windows. A large barn stood nearby, and she could hear the nickering of horses inside. Gathering her courage, Penny approached the front door. Her knuckles had barely touched the wood when it swung open, startling her backward. A tall man stood in the doorframe, backlit by the fire inside. He wore a worn leather vest over a cotton shirt, and dusty denims tucked into scuffed boots. A day's worth of stubble darkened his jawline, and his eyes, though shadowed by his hat brim, seemed to pierce right through her. "Can I help you, miss?" His voice was deep, tinged with the drawl of someone who'd spent time in Texas. Penny faltered, suddenly realizing how improper it was for an unmarried woman to appear on a bachelor's doorstep after dark, but desperation pushed her forward. "My name is Penelope Miller. I wonder if you might have any work available. I can cook, clean, so anything you might need." The man tilted his head slightly, taking in her appearance the fine quality of her dress despite the dust of travel, the small satchel clutched in white-knuckled fingers, and the unmistakable protective way she held her other hand over her midsection. "I'm Hayes Donovan," he said finally. "Most folks call me Hawk." He paused, seeming to consider her request. "Don't recall putting out word that I needed help." "No, sir," Penny admitted. Her voice caught as emotion threatened to overwhelm her. Hayes stepped back from the doorway. "Why don't you come inside, Miss Miller? Night's getting cold, and it looks like you've been walking a fair piece." Relief flooded through her as she stepped into the warmth of the cabin. It was simply furnished but tidy, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall and the smell of coffee and something savory hanging in the air. "Thank you," she said, still standing awkwardly near the door. "Sit." He gestured to a chair at the small table. "I've got stew warming. You look like you could use a meal." As he busied himself ladling stew into a bowl, Penny took the opportunity to study him. Hayes Donovan was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 30 or so, with broad shoulders and the lean, muscular build of a man who worked hard for his living. His hair, visible now that he'd removed his hat, was a rich brown that caught copper highlights from the firelight. "Here," he said, placing the bowl before her along with a chunk of bread. "Eat while it's hot." Penny hadn't realized how hungry she was until the aroma of the stew reached her. She ate quickly, trying to maintain some semblance of ladylike manners despite her ravenous appetite. Hayes sat across from her, nursing a cup of coffee, his gaze steady but not unkind. "So," he said finally, "you want to tell me the real reason you're wandering the countryside after dark, Miss Miller?" Penny set down her spoon, her appetite suddenly gone despite the half-full bowl. "My father cast me out," she said, finding strange relief in the blunt truth. "I'm with child and there's no husband. The man responsible has long since departed these parts." She braced herself for judgment, for the disgust that had twisted her father's features, perhaps even for being told to leave. Instead, Hayes merely nodded slowly. "And your family, no one would take you in. My father's word is law in our household. My mother," Penny swallowed hard. She couldn't defy him. Hayes rose and refilled his coffee cup, then stood looking out the window into the darkness for a long moment. When he turned back, his expression was unreadable. "I do need help around here," he said finally. "Can't say I'm much of a housekeeper, and the place could use a woman's touch. There's a small room off the kitchen, nothing fancy, but it's private. It's yours if you want it." Penny stared at him, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "You would do that for a stranger, a fallen woman?" Something flashed in Hayes's eyes, anger perhaps, though not directed at her. "I don't see any fallen woman here, Miss Miller, just someone who's had a run of bad luck." He paused. "My door's open to you for as long as you need it." The simple kindness, after everything she'd endured that day, broke through the last of Penny's composure. Tears spilled down her cheeks despite her best efforts to contain them. I don't know how to thank you," she managed. "No need," Hayes said gruffly, clearly uncomfortable with her tears. "Finish your stew. I'll show you to your room after." As Penny ate, Hayes moved about the cabin, gathering extra blankets and a lantern for her room. She watched him covertly, wondering what kind of man would open his home to a pregnant, unmarried woman without question. In her experience, men weren't known for such charity without expecting something in return. When she'd finished eating, Hayes showed her to the promised room. It was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, and a small window. "It's not much," he said, sounding almost apologetic. "It's perfect," Penny replied, meaning it. After believing she might be sleeping in a stable or worse, the simple room seemed luxurious. "Well," Hayes said, shifting awkwardly, "bathroom's out back. There's water in the pitcher there for washing up. I rise early to tend the stock, but you rest as long as you need tomorrow. We can talk more about work arrangements then." "Thank you, Mr. Donovan," Penny said softly. "Truly." He nodded once, then turned to leave. "Mr. Donovan," she called after him. He paused in the doorway. "Hayes," he corrected. "Hayes," she repeated. "May I ask why? Why help me?" He was silent for so long she thought he might not answer. Finally, he said, "Everyone deserves a second chance, Miss Miller, even those who never got a proper first one." With that cryptic statement, he closed the door gently behind him. Alone in her new room, Penny sat on the edge of the bed, hands cradling her small bump. For the first time since discovering her condition, she felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps there was a way forward after all. The next morning, Penny awoke to the sounds of activity outside her window. Rising quickly, she washed her face in the basin, pinned up her long auburn hair, and changed into her spare dress, a simple blue cotton that had seen better days but would serve for work. When she emerged into the main room, Hayes was nowhere to be seen, but a pot of coffee sat warming on the stove, and a note lay on the table. "Help yourself to breakfast. I'm in the corral with the new stock." Penny found bread, preserves, and some dried apple slices in the pantry. After a quick breakfast, she set about taking inventory of the cabin. It was clear a woman hadn't touched the place in some time. While not filthy, it lacked the attention to detail that transformed a house into a home. Determined to earn her keep, Penny spent the morning cleaning. She scrubbed the floors, dusted every surface, and organized the pantry. By midday, she had moved on to tackling the pile of mending she'd found in a basket near the fireplace: shirts with missing buttons, socks with holes, and pants with torn knees. She was so absorbed in her work that she didn't hear Hayes enter until his shadow fell across her sewing. "You didn't have to start work right away," he said, removing his hat and hanging it on a peg by the door. Penny looked up, needle poised mid-stitch. "I wanted to." "You've been very kind, and I need to feel useful." Hayes nodded, seeming to understand. His eyes moved around the cabin, noting the changes. Place hasn't looked this good since my mother was alive. I hope I haven't overstepped, Penny said quickly. No, he assured her. It's good. He moved to the basin to wash up. I've got to ride into town for supplies this afternoon. Anything you need, Penny hesitated. I don't have money for consider it part of your wages, Hayes interrupted. Make a list of what you need within reason. Thank you, she said softly, setting aside her mending. I'll prepare lunch before you go. As the days passed, Penny and Hayes settled into a comfortable rhythm. She kept house and cooked meals. He tended the ranch and occasionally took odd jobs breaking horses for neighboring properties. He was often gone from sunup to sundown, but always returned for the evening meal, which they took together at the small kitchen table. Their conversations were stilted at first, but gradually grew more natural. Hayes wasn't one for idle chatter, but he was a good listener, and Penny found herself sharing stories of her life in Silver Creek. In turn, he occasionally offered glimpses of his past years spent driving cattle in Texas, a stint mining in Colorado, even a brief period working on riverboats along the Mississippi. You've lived quite the adventurous life, Penny remarked one evening as they sat by the fire, she with her mending and he with a whittling project. Hayes shrugged. Just restless, I guess. Never found a place that felt right enough to stay. What brought you back here? She asked. His hands stilled on the piece of wood he was shaping. My father's letter, he was sick, thought I might make it back in time, but he shook his head. I was too late. I'm sorry, Penny said quietly. We weren't close, Hayes admitted, but he was my father, I owed him that much. He returned to his whittling, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. Penny decided to change the subject. What are you making? Hayes held up the small piece of wood which was beginning to take the shape of a horse. Just passing time. My grandfather taught me when I was a boy. It's beautiful, Penny said, genuinely impressed. A hint of a smile touched Hayes's mouth so brief she almost missed it. It's nothing special. But the next morning, Penny found the completed carving on the kitchen table, a perfectly rendered miniature horse, each detail lovingly crafted. She placed it on the windowsill, where the morning sun caught its smooth curves. When Hayes came in for breakfast, his eyes went to the carving, then to her face. He said nothing, but Penny thought she detected a pleased expression before he turned away. As her 4th month of pregnancy progressed, Penny's condition became more noticeable. Her dresses grew tighter around the middle, and she spent evenings letting out seams to accommodate her changing body. Hayes never mentioned it directly, but she sometimes caught him looking at her belly with an unreadable expression. One morning, as Penny was hanging laundry on the line behind the house, she heard the approach of horses. Shielding her eyes against the sun, she saw 3 riders coming up the path to the ranch. As they drew closer, her blood ran cold. It was her father, accompanied by the town's sheriff and the local preacher. Panic seized her. Had they come to drag her back, or worse, to arrest Hayes for harboring her? The baby fluttered inside her, as if sensing her distress. She hurried inside to find Hayes, who was repairing a bridle at the kitchen table. Hayes, she said urgently, my father is coming, with Sheriff Taylor and Reverend Williams. Hayes's head snapped up, his expression immediately alert. Are you sure? Yes, she said, wringing her hands. What should I do? Should I hide? Hayes rose, setting aside his work. No, he said firmly. You have nothing to hide from. This is your home now if you want it to be. The simple declaration, your home, nearly undid her, but there was no time for tears. The sound of hooves in the yard announced their visitors had arrived. Stay here, Hayes instructed, his voice gentle but brooking no argument. Let me handle this. Penny nodded, though every instinct screamed to flee. She watched through the window as Hayes stepped onto the porch to meet the 3 men. Her father, Josiah Miller, was the first to dismount. Even from a distance, Penny could see the anger in the set of his shoulders. A tall, imposing man with a full beard now streaked with gray, he had ruled their household with an iron fist for as long as she could remember. Donovan, he called out, not bothering with pleasantries. I believe you have something that belongs to me. Hayes stood with his thumbs hooked in his belt, relaxed but watchful. Don't recall taking anything of yours, Miller, my daughter, Miller spat. Word is she's been living here in sin for near a month now. The sheriff, a portly man with a perpetually worried expression, cleared his throat. Now, Josiah, we don't know that for certain. What other reason would a man have for keeping a ruined woman under his roof? Miller demanded. Hayes's posture changed subtly. Though he still appeared calm, Penny could see tension in the line of his shoulders. I'd be careful about throwing around accusations, Miller. Miss Penelope is employed here as my housekeeper, nothing more. A likely story, Miller scoffed. The Reverend, a thin man with a perpetual squint, spoke up. Mr. Donovan, surely you understand how this appears to the community. An unmarried woman living under the same roof as a bachelor. It's highly irregular. What's irregular, Hayes said, his voice hardening, is a father turning out his own flesh and blood when she most needs his support. Miller's face reddened. How I discipline my family is no concern of yours. It became my concern when your daughter showed up at my door with nowhere else to go, Hayes countered. Penny couldn't stand it any longer. Taking a deep breath, she stepped out onto the porch. All four men turned to look at her, and she felt her father's gaze drop immediately to her swollen midsection, visible now even under her apron. Father, she acknowledged, keeping her voice steady with effort. Penelope, he said coldly, get your things, you're coming home. Hope flared briefly in her chest, quickly extinguished by his next words. The Wilsons have agreed to take you in until your condition is resolved. Then arrangements will be made to place the child with a suitable family. You'll stay with your aunt in Denver until the scandal dies down. Penny felt as though she'd been struck. You want me to give up my baby? It's the only sensible solution, her father said dismissively. You can't expect to raise a bastard child on your own, and no decent man will have you otherwise. Before Penny could respond, Hayes stepped forward, placing himself slightly in front of her in a protective gesture that wasn't lost on any of them. Miss Miller isn't going anywhere she doesn't want to go, he said, his voice quiet but carrying an unmistakable edge of steel. Sheriff Taylor shifted uncomfortably. Now, Hawk, we don't want any trouble here. There won't be any, Hayes assured him, as long as everyone remembers that Miss Miller is a grown woman who can make her own decisions. The Reverend adjusted his collar nervously. Perhaps we should all take a moment to Penelope, her father cut in, ignoring the others. I won't ask again. Get your things now. Penny straightened her spine, drawing strength from Hayes's solid presence beside her. No, father, I appreciate your concern. But I won't be giving up my child, and I won't be returning home under those conditions. Her father's face darkened. Then you are no longer my daughter. Whatever happens to you from here on out is on your own head. He turned to the sheriff. Taylor, surely there's some law against this arrangement. Sheriff Taylor removed his hat, running a hand through thinning hair. Well now, Josiah, she is of age, and if Mr. Donovan here is employing her proper-like. This is outrageous, Miller sputtered. Reverend, surely you have something to say about this immoral situation. The Reverend looked distinctly uncomfortable. I would certainly prefer to see things on a more conventional footing. Perhaps, Mr. Donovan, if you were to consider, thank you for your concern, gentlemen, Hayes interrupted firmly. But as I said, Miss Miller's arrangements are her own business. Now, unless there's actual law being broken here, I think we're done. For a tense moment, Penny thought her father might try to force the issue. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, and a vein throbbed visibly at his temple. But finally, with a last venomous look at Penny, he turned and stomped back to his horse. You'll regret this, he called over his shoulder as he mounted. Both of you. The sheriff and Reverend, clearly relieved to avoid further confrontation, tipped their hats awkwardly before following Miller down the path. Penny and Hayes stood silently on the porch until the three riders disappeared from view. Only when they were gone did Penny realize she was trembling. Hayes noticed too, gently taking her elbow to guide her back inside. Sit, he said, pulling out a chair at the table. I'll make some tea. Penny obeyed, watching in a daze as Hayes, a man who wrestled cattle and broke wild horses, carefully prepared tea as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Thank you, she said when he set a steaming cup before her. For standing up to them, for everything. Hayes sat across from her, his own cup cradled between calloused hands. Your father had no right to speak to you that way. He's always been stern, Penny said, searching for a diplomatic word. but I never thought he'd disown me completely." Hayes was quiet for a moment. "My father and I didn't see eye to eye on much," he said finally. "But even at our worst, I never doubted he'd have taken me in if I needed it." "You were fortunate," Penny said softly. Hayes's expression darkened. "What your father suggested, giving up your baby, that's what you want." "No." The vehemence of her response surprised even her. "No," she repeated more calmly. "I could never. This child is innocent in all this, and despite how it came to be, it's mine." Hayes nodded, seemingly satisfied with her answer. "Good." They sat in companionable silence for a while, sipping their tea. Penny found her thoughts drifting to the protective way Hayes had positioned himself between her and her father, the quiet authority in his voice when he defended her. No one had ever stood up for her like that before. "Hayes," she said suddenly, "why did you really take me in that night? The truth, please." Hayes set down his cup, his eyes meeting hers directly for perhaps the first time. They were a striking blue-gray, like the sky before a storm. "My mother died when I was born," he said, the words coming slowly as if pulled from somewhere deep. "My father never said it outright, but I always knew he blamed me. There was a woman in town, Hannah, her name was, who'd lost her baby around the same time. She helped care for me those first years." He paused, his gaze distant with memory. "When I was about 4, she found herself in a situation not unlike yours, unmarried with child. The town turned its back on her." His jaw tightened. "My father included. What happened to her?" Penny asked softly. "She left, had nowhere to go." "They found her that winter, frozen to death in an abandoned shack about 10 miles from here." His voice had gone flat, emotionless. "The baby too." Penny felt tears welling in her eyes. "I'm so sorry," Hayes shrugged, but the casual gesture couldn't disguise the old pain in his eyes. "It was a long time ago, but I promised myself if I ever had the chance to help someone in her situation, I would." He looked at her directly again. "That's why, Miss Miller." Penny reached across the table impulsively, covering his hand with hers. "Penny," she said. "Please call me Penny." Something shifted in Hayes's expression, a softening around the eyes, perhaps. "Penny," he repeated, and the sound of her name in his deep voice sent an unexpected warmth through her. After a moment, he gently withdrew his hand and stood. "I should finish with those horses before dark." Penny nodded, suddenly aware of how forward she'd been. "And I should start supper." As Hayes headed for the door, he paused. "Penny," she looked up from gathering the tea cups. "Yes. What your father said about no decent man wanting you because of the baby." He hesitated, seeming to choose his words carefully. "He's wrong about that, just so you know." Before she could respond, he was gone, the door closing softly behind him. Penny stood in the middle of the kitchen, one hand absently stroking her rounded belly, wondering why his words had made her heart beat just a little faster. The weeks passed, and autumn gave way to winter. The first snow came early that year, blanketing the ranch in pristine white that glittered under the cold sunlight. Penny had never experienced winter outside of town, and she marveled at the quiet beauty of the land. Her pregnancy progressed steadily, her belly growing rounder with each passing day. To her surprise, Hayes proved unexpectedly attentive to her condition. He brought home a rocking chair he'd purchased in town, insisting she needed to rest her feet more. When she mentioned her back aching, he appeared the next day with a special cushion stuffed with goose down. Most surprisingly, he began taking on more of the household chores as her pregnancy advanced, despite her protests that she was perfectly capable. "I'm with child, not invalid," she told him one evening when he insisted on washing the supper dishes. "Humor me," he replied, the ghost of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. These small smiles had become more frequent, Penny noticed. When she'd first arrived, Hayes had been solemn, almost grim. But as the weeks passed, something in him seemed to be thawing, like the creek after a hard freeze. One evening in early December, they sat by the fire after supper, Penny working on a small gown for the baby while Hayes read from a well-worn copy of The Three Musketeers. "Have you thought about names?" Hayes asked suddenly, looking up from his book, Penny's hands stilled on her sewing. "A few," she admitted. "Mary if it's a girl after my grandmother, for a boy." She hesitated. "I'm not sure yet," Hayes nodded thoughtfully. "Good names are important." Did your name have special meaning? Penny asked, realizing she knew little about his early life. Hayes was my mother's family name, he said. As for hawk, that came later. Some cowboys I rode with in Texas said I had eyes like a hawk, always spotting trouble before anyone else. He shrugged. It stuck. It suits you, Penny said honestly. Their eyes met across the small space between them, and something unspoken passed between them, a current of understanding, of growing connection. Penny felt her cheeks warm, and she quickly returned her attention to her sewing. You should teach me to shoot, she said abruptly, surprising herself as much as him. Hayes raised an eyebrow. Any particular reason? You're often away during the day, she pointed out. And after what happened with my father, I'd feel safer knowing how to protect myself. And the baby, she added, one hand moving to her belly. Hayes considered this, then nodded slowly. Fair enough. We'll start tomorrow if the weather holds. True to his word, the next day Hayes brought out an old Colt revolver that had belonged to his father. It's smaller than mine, he explained. Better fit for your hand. Over the next several days, he patiently taught her the basics: how to load and unload, how to aim, how to account for the recoil. Penny proved a quick study, and by the end of the week, she could hit a can placed on a fence post with reasonable consistency. You're a natural, Hayes commented after a particularly good shot. Penny beamed with pride. My father always said women had no business with firearms. Your father, Hayes said dryly, seems to have had a lot of opinions about what women should and shouldn't do. Penny laughed, a free and genuine sound that echoed across the snow-covered yard. That he did. Hayes watched her, something warm and appreciative in his gaze. It's good to hear you laugh, he said quietly. Before Penny could respond, she felt a strong kick from the baby, stronger than any before. Oh, she exclaimed, her hand flying to her side. Hayes was immediately alert. What is it? Are you all right? Yes, she assured him. The baby, it's kicking quite forcefully today. Hayes relaxed, though he still looked concerned. Should you be resting? Would you like to feel it? Penny asked impulsively, then immediately regretted her boldness. Such intimacy was hardly proper between a man and woman who weren't married. Hayes looked startled by the offer, and Penny was about to apologize when he stepped closer. If you're sure it's all right, he said, his voice oddly hesitant for such a confident man. Penny nodded, taking his large, calloused hand and placing it on the side of her belly where the baby was most active. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, as if on cue, the baby delivered a solid kick right against Hayes's palm. His eyes widened in wonder, all his usual reserve falling away. That's something, he murmured, his hand warm through the fabric of her dress. The baby kicked again, and Hayes let out a soft laugh of surprise. Strong little thing, isn't it? Like its mother, Penny said with a smile. Hayes's eyes lifted to hers, his hand still resting gently on her belly. Yes, he agreed softly. Exactly like its mother. The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with something Penny wasn't quite ready to name. Hayes's gaze dropped briefly to her lips, then back to her eyes, a question in his expression. The moment was broken by the distant sound of approaching hooves. Hayes straightened immediately, his hand falling away from her as he turned toward the sound. Stay here, he said, all business again as he strode toward the house, presumably for his rifle. Penny shielded her eyes against the winter sun, trying to make out the approaching rider. Relief flooded through her when she recognized Doc Ferguson's ancient mare. The elderly physician was Silver Creek's only doctor, a gruff but kind-hearted man who had delivered most of the town's children over the last 30 years. Hayes returned with his rifle, but lowered it when he too recognized the visitor. Doc, he called in greeting as the old man rode up. Bit far from town, aren't you? The doctor dismounted stiffly, his breath visible in the cold air. Got word there was a lady in a delicate condition out this way, he said, his sharp eyes taking in Penny's rounded figure. Thought I'd pay a professional call. Penny stepped forward. Dr. Ferguson, it's good to see you. Recognition dawned in the old man's eyes. Miss Miller. Well, I'll be. Your mother mentioned you'd gone to stay with relatives. A convenient fiction, I'm afraid, Penny said, feeling a pang at the mention of her mother. The doctor harumphed noncommittally. Well, be that as it may, you're what 6 months along now, about time you had a proper examination. Hayes cleared his throat. I'll see to your horse, Doc. You two can use the house. After the doctor's examination, which he conducted with brisk efficiency and surprising gentleness, he pronounced both Penny and the baby to be in excellent health. You're carrying high, he noted as she readjusted her clothing. Old wives would say that means a girl. Penny smiled, secretly pleased at the idea. Is that true? The doctor snorted. Who knows, I've seen it go both ways, but everything looks as it should. Baby's got a strong heartbeat. Thank you for coming all this way, Penny said, reaching for her small purse. What do I owe you? The doctor waved away her money. Consider it a favor to your mother. She's worried about you, you know. Penny's hands stilled. You've spoken with her. She came to me asking if I knew of any remedies for sleeplessness. Said she hadn't had a good night's rest since her daughter left. He fixed Penny with a pointed look. Some wounds can only be healed by time and forgiveness, Miss Miller. Penny nodded, her throat tight with sudden emotion. If you see her, please tell her I'm well and that I miss her. I'll do that, the doctor promised. As he gathered his things, he added casually, Donovan seems to be taking good care of you. Penny felt herself blush. Mr. Donovan has been very kind to employ me in my condition. The doctor raised a bushy eyebrow. Is that what they're calling it these days, employment? It's the truth, Penny insisted, her cheeks burning hotter. I keep house for him, nothing more, hum, the doctor hummed skeptically. Well, whatever the arrangement, you seem well settled, better than you would have been with the Wilsons, I'd wager. You know about that. Small town, Miss Miller, not much happens that doesn't make its way to my ears eventually. He closed his bag with a decisive snap. For what it's worth, I think you're better off here. Jonathan Wilson drinks too much and his wife has a tongue sharp enough to cut glass. Hayes returned as the doctor was preparing to leave, stamping snow from his boots at the door. Everything all right? He asked, his eyes going to Penny with unmistakable concern. Mother and child are doing splendidly, the doctor assured him. Just make sure she keeps eating well and gets plenty of rest. I will, Hayes promised, with such seriousness that the doctor and Penny exchanged amused glances. After seeing the doctor off, Hayes insisted Penny rest by the fire while he prepared their evening meal, a role reversal that would have been unthinkable in most households. The doctor said I'm perfectly healthy, Penny protested. He also said you need rest, Hayes countered, gently but firmly steering her toward her rocking chair. I'm perfectly capable of frying up some bacon and beans, Penny acquiesced, secretly enjoying being cared for. As she watched Hayes move about the kitchen, his large frame somehow managing not to seem out of place among the pots and pans, a strange feeling of contentment washed over her. Despite everything, the scandal, her father's rejection, the uncertainty of her future in this moment, she felt safe. At home. The realization was both comforting and terrifying. This arrangement with Hayes was temporary, she reminded herself firmly. Once the baby came, she would need to find a more permanent situation, perhaps in another town where her reputation wouldn't precede her. The thought of leaving the ranch, of leaving Hayes, caused an unexpected pang in her chest. Penny, Hayes's voice broke into her thoughts. You all right? You looked far away just then. She forced a smile. Just thinking about the future. Something flickered in Hayes's expression. Anything in particular? Penny hesitated. I should start making plans, for after the baby comes. Hayes turned back to the stove, his shoulders stiffening slightly. What kind of plans? I can't impose on your hospitality forever, Penny said softly. Perhaps I could find work in one of the larger towns. Denver, maybe. Hayes was silent for a long moment, his back still turned to her. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. No need to rush into decisions. You have a place here for as long as you want it. Before Penny could respond, there was a sharp rap at the door. Hayes frowned, setting down the spoon he'd been using to stir the beans. Stay put, he told Penny, moving to answer the door. When he opened it, Penny was shocked to see her mother standing on the porch, snow-dusting her dark cloak and bonnet. Mrs. Miller, Hayes said, surprise evident in his voice. Mr. Donovan, Penny's mother replied formally. I apologize for the intrusion, but I wonder if I might speak with my daughter. Hayes glanced back at Penny, who had risen from her chair in shock. At her nod, he stepped aside to allow Martha Miller entry. "Mother," Penny said, scarcely believing her eyes. Her mother had never directly defied her father in all the years of their marriage. "What are you doing here?" Martha Miller unwound her scarf, her eyes taking in her daughter's expanded waistline before meeting her gaze. "Dr. Ferguson said you were well, but I needed to see for myself." Penny glanced at Hayes, who immediately took the hint. "I'll check on the stock," he said, grabbing his coat. "Take all the time you need." When the door closed behind him, Martha stepped forward hesitantly. "You look healthy." "I am," Penny assured her. "Hayes, Mr. Donovan has been very kind." Martha glanced around the cabin, noting the feminine touches Penny had added over the month's curtains at the windows, a quilted cushion on the rocking chair, dried flowers arranged in a jar on the table. "You've made a home here," she observed. "For now," Penny said. Martha moved closer, her hands fluttering nervously before reaching out to touch Penny's rounded belly. "May I?" Penny nodded, placing her mother's hand where the baby was most likely to kick. Sure enough, after a moment, there was a firm bump against Martha's palm. "Oh." Martha exclaimed, her eyes filling with tears. "My grandchild. Father said I was no longer his daughter," Penny said quietly. "Does that mean this baby is not his grandchild?" Martha's expression hardened in a way Penny had rarely seen. "Your father is a proud man. Too proud for his own good or anyone else's. He may not admit it, but he misses you terribly." "Not enough to accept my child, it seems," Penny said, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. "Give him time," Martha pleaded. "He may come around, especially once the baby is born." Penny shook her head. "I won't hide my child away like something shameful, Mother. If Father can't accept us both, then he'll have neither of us." Martha sighed, but there was a glint of approval in her eyes. "You've changed, Penelope. There's a strength in you I've never seen before." "I've had to be strong," Penny said simply. Martha looked around the cabin again, her gaze lingering on the two-place settings laid out for supper, the pair of boots, one large, one small by the door, the book left open on the arm of Hayes's chair. "Mr. Donovan," she said carefully. "He's been honorable in his dealings with you." Penny felt herself flush. "Completely. He's given me work, shelter, nothing more." Martha studied her daughter's face intently. "But you wish it were more," she said, not a question but a statement. "Mother," Penny protested. "I've been married 25 years, Penelope. I know the look of a woman with feelings for a man." She paused. "Does he return your affection?" Penny sank back into her rocking chair, suddenly exhausted by the weight of unspoken truths. "I don't know," she admitted. "Sometimes I think perhaps he might, but my situation is hardly conducive to romance." Martha sat in the chair opposite, reaching out to take her daughter's hands. "Listen to me, Penelope. Whatever mistakes you may have made, you deserve happiness. If there's a chance for it with this man, don't let your father's disapproval or society's judgment stand in your way." Penny stared at her mother in astonishment. "I never thought I'd hear you say such things." A sad smile crossed Martha's face. "Perhaps watching my only child cast out has made me reconsider what truly matters in this life." She squeezed Penny's hands. "I want you to be happy, my girl, safe and happy." "I am safe here," Penny said softly, "and happier than I expected to be given the circumstances." Martha nodded, seeming satisfied. "Good." She reached into her cloak and withdrew a small package wrapped in brown paper. "I brought a few things. Some of your old baby clothes I saved," and she hesitated. "Some money, not much, but enough to help when the time comes." Penny took the package, tears welling in her eyes. "Won't Father notice it's missing?" "Let me worry about your father," Martha said firmly. They talked for nearly an hour, Martha sharing news of the town and Penny describing her life at the ranch. When at last Martha rose to leave, the light was fading from the winter sky. "I should go," she said reluctantly. "Your father thinks I'm visiting Mrs. Henderson." Penny embraced her mother tightly. "Thank you for coming. It means more than I can say." "I'll try to visit again," Martha promised. "And perhaps I can work on your father. His bark has always been worse than his bite." As they stepped onto the porch, they saw Hayes coming from the barn, leading Martha's horse. "I thought you might be leaving soon," he explained, bringing the animal forward. Gave her some oats and water. "Thank you, Mr. Donovan," Martha said, studying him with new interest. and thank you for taking care of my daughter when her family failed her." Hayes inclined his head slightly. "It's been no hardship, madam. Your daughter is." He glanced at Penny, something warm in his eyes. "She's brought life back to this place." Martha looked between them, a knowing expression crossing her face. "I can see that," she murmured. After helping Martha mount, Hayes stepped back to stand beside Penny as they watched her mother ride away. "Your mother seems like a good woman," he commented as the figure grew smaller in the distance. "She is," Penny agreed. "Just not strong enough to stand up to my father, until now, perhaps." They stood together in the fading light, the winter air crisp around them, their breath forming small clouds. Without thinking, Penny slipped her hand into Hayes's. After a moment's surprise, his fingers closed around hers, warm and secure. "Thank you," she said simply. He didn't ask what for. He just squeezed her hand gently, and they remained that way, connected, until the cold finally drove them back inside. Christmas approached, bringing with it a festive atmosphere despite their modest circumstances. Penny decorated the cabin with pine boughs and red berries, and spent days baking cookies and fruitcake from carefully hoarded supplies. Hayes brought home a small pine tree, which they adorned with strings of dried berries and paper ornaments Penny crafted in the evenings. On Christmas Eve, they sat by the fire after a simple but satisfying dinner, the cabin filled with the scent of pine and cinnamon. Hayes surprised Penny by producing a small package from his coat pocket. "It's not much," he said gruffly, handing it to her. Penny unwrapped the paper carefully to find a delicate silver locket on a fine chain. "Hayes," she breathed, opening the locket to find it empty, waiting for a memento. "It's beautiful. Thought you might want to put a lock of the baby's hair in it when the time comes," he explained, looking almost embarrassed. "It's perfect," Penny said, blinking back tears as she fastened it around her neck. "I have something for you too." She retrieved a package from her room, a new shirt she had sewn secretly during the long evenings, using fabric she'd purchased with some of the money her mother had brought. Hayes ran his fingers over the careful stitching, his expression soft with wonder. "No one's made me clothing since I was a boy," he said quietly. "Try it on," Penny encouraged. He obliged, and the dark blue fabric complemented his tanned skin and brought out the color of his eyes. Penny felt a flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with the baby. "Thank you," he said, his voice husky with emotion. Later, as the fire burned low and the night deepened around them, Hayes surprised her again by asking, "Would you mind if would it be all right if I felt the baby again?" Penny smiled, touched by his tentative request. "Of course." This time, there was no pretense of maintaining distance. Hayes moved his chair closer to hers, and when he placed his hand on her belly, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. The baby, as if sensing the importance of the moment, delivered a series of strong kicks that made them both laugh. "Active little thing," Hayes commented, his hand warm through the fabric of Penny's dress. "Especially at night," Penny said, "just when I'm trying to sleep." Hayes smiled, the firelight casting his features in a gentle glow. His hand remained on her belly, and neither of them seemed inclined to end the moment. "Penny," he said finally, his voice low, "I've been thinking about what you said, about making plans for after the baby comes." Her heart sank a little. "Yes, I don't want you to go to Denver," he said bluntly, "or anywhere else for that matter." Penny stared at him, hardly daring to hope what his words might mean. "I can't stay here indefinitely as your housekeeper, Hayes. That's not what I'm asking." He took a deep breath, his eyes steady on hers. "I'm asking you to stay as my wife." The words hung in the air between them, momentous and transformative. Penny felt as though the world had suddenly tilted on its axis. "Your wife," she repeated faintly. "Hayes, you don't have to do that." "I don't need your charity." A flash of something hurt perhaps crossed his face. "This isn't charity, Penny. I'm asking because I want you here, because these past months with you have been the happiest I can remember. But the baby, I'll raise the child as my own," he said firmly. "No one ever need know differently." Penny shook her head, trying to make sense of his offer. "You would do that. Take on another man's child, it's your child," Hayes said simply. "That's enough for me." Tears filled Penny's eyes. "But what about love? Don't you want to marry for love?" Hayes's expression softened, and he reached up to brush a tear from her cheek. "Penny," he said gently. Why do you think I'm asking? The realization dawned slowly, like the sun breaking over the horizon. You love me, she whispered. I think I've loved you since that first night when you stood on my porch with your chin up, determined to make your own way despite everything, he admitted. But if you don't feel the same, I understand. The offer stands regardless. Penny placed her hand over his where it still rested on her belly. I do feel the same, she said, her voice trembling with emotion. I love you, Hayes Donovan. The smile that broke across his face was like nothing she'd seen before, radiant, unguarded, transforming his usually solemn features. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, but quickly deepened as months of unspoken longing found expression. Penny's arms wound around his neck, drawing him closer, and she felt his hand move from her belly to cup her face tenderly. When they finally parted, both breathless, Hayes rested his forehead against hers. Is that a yes, then? He murmured. Penny laughed, joy bubbling up inside her like a spring. Yes, she said. Yes, I'll marry you. They were wed 2 weeks later in a small ceremony performed by the Justice of the Peace in the neighboring town of Clearwater, where fewer people knew Penny's story. Doc Ferguson stood as witness, along with the local blacksmith and his wife. Penny wore a simple dress of deep green wool, altered to accommodate her growing belly, with Hayes's locket around her neck and wild winter roses in her hair. Hayes had a new haircut and wore the shirt she'd made him, with a borrowed suit coat that was slightly too small across his broad shoulders. When the justice pronounced them man and wife, Hayes kissed her with such tenderness that even the blacksmith's stoic wife dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. The winter weeks that followed were a time of quiet joy as they settled into married life and prepared for the baby's arrival. Hayes built a cradle from pine, carving delicate leaves and animals along its edges. Penny sewed constantly tiny gowns, blankets, caps for the small head they would soon meet. Word of their marriage eventually reached Silver Creek, of course. Penny's mother sent a letter of congratulations, along with a parcel containing more baby clothes and a wedding gift, a fine quilt that had been in her family for generations. There was no word from her father. February brought heavy snow that isolated the ranch for days at a time. Hayes kept the paths to the barn and well cleared, but they ventured into town only when absolutely necessary. They spent the long evenings by the fire, Hayes reading aloud while Penny sewed, or simply talking about their hopes for the future. I've been thinking, Hayes said one night as they lay in bed, his hand resting protectively over her enormous belly. If it's a boy, what would you think about naming him Henry, after my grandfather? Penny turned her head to look at him in the dim light. Henry, she repeated, testing the name. I like it. Henry Donovan has a strong sound. Hayes smiled, pressing a kiss to her temple. And if it's a girl, we could still use Mary like you wanted. Mary Hayes Donovan, Penny mused. It's perfect. Hayes's arm tightened around her. I never thought I'd have this, he admitted, his voice low in the darkness. A wife, a child on the way, a real family. Nor I, Penny said softly, especially not after everything. Hayes propped himself up on one elbow, looking down at her seriously. Do you ever regret it? Meeting that gambler, I mean. Penny considered the question carefully. I regret my foolishness, she said finally, but I can't regret what came of it, not when it led me here to you, and not when it's giving us this child. Hayes nodded, seeming satisfied with her answer. He settled back beside her, his solid presence comforting as the wind howled outside. I love you, Mrs. Donovan, he murmured against her hair. And I love you, Mr. Donovan, she replied, nestling closer as sleep claimed them both. The baby decided to arrive in the midst of the worst blizzard of the season. Penny woke in the early hours of the morning, a sharp pain gripping her midsection. Hayes, she gasped, clutching his arm. It's time. He was instantly alert, helping her sit up as another contraction seized her. How far apart are they? Not very, Penny admitted, breathing through the pain. I've been having twinges since yesterday, but I thought it was just false labor. Hayes's expression was a mixture of concern and determination. I'll go for the doctor, Penny grabbed his wrist. No. The storm, you can't go out in that. It's too dangerous. As if to emphasize her point, the wind shrieked around the cabin, rattling the windows in their frames. "I can't just let you suffer," Hayes argued. "Women have been having babies without doctors since the beginning of time," Penny said, trying to sound braver than she felt. "I'll be all right, but I need you here, not frozen in a snowdrift." Hayes looked torn, but another contraction made the decision for them. Penny couldn't suppress a cry of pain, and Hayes's face set in resolve. "All right," he said. "No doctor, but you'll tell me what to do." The next hours were a blur of pain and effort for Penny. Hayes proved remarkably steady, heating water, preparing clean linens, and supporting her through each contraction. He helped her walk when the pain allowed and held her hands when it became too intense. "You're doing wonderfully," he encouraged as morning light began to filter through the windows. "You're the strongest woman I've ever known." Penny, drenched in sweat and exhausted beyond measure, managed a weak smile. "I don't feel very strong right now." "You are," Hayes assured her, wiping her forehead with a cool cloth. "Our child is lucky to have you for a mother." Another contraction gripped her, stronger than any before. "Hayes," she gasped when it passed, "I think it's time. I need to push." What followed was the hardest work Penny had ever done. Hayes positioned himself to help, his face pale but determined. "I can see the head," he said after what seemed like hours of pushing. "One more, Penny, one more big push." Gathering her remaining strength, Penny bore down with everything she had. There was a moment of searing pain, then a sensation of release, and suddenly the cabin was filled with the thin, indignant cry of a newborn. "It's a girl," Hayes said, his voice choked with emotion as he cradled the tiny, wriggling form. "We have a daughter, Penny." Tears streamed down Penny's face as Hayes placed the baby on her chest. "Hello, Mary," she whispered, counting fingers and toes, marveling at the perfect miniature features. "Welcome to the world." Hayes sat beside them on the bed, one arm around Penny, the other hand gently touching the baby's dark hair. "She's beautiful," he said, wonder in his voice, "just like her mother." Penny looked up at him, seeing tears in his eyes. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything. For giving her a name, a home." "She's mine," Hayes said simply, his finger captured in the baby's tiny grasp. "From this moment on, she's my daughter in every way that matters." The storm raged on outside, but inside the cabin, a new family huddled together in a bubble of exhausted joy, the bonds between them stronger than blood or law could ever define. Spring came to Wyoming in fits and starts that year, with late snows giving way to sudden warm days, then back to cold again. By April, however, the land had fully awakened, with green grass pushing up through the soil and wildflowers dotting the meadows. Mary Hayes Donovan thrived, growing from a tiny, red-faced newborn into a plump, smiling infant with her mother's auburn hair and curious eyes. Hayes was besotted with his daughter, carrying her around the ranch as he did his chores, talking to her as if she understood every word. "She'll be the best horsewoman in the territory," he told Penny proudly one evening as Mary slept in his arms. "Did you see how she watches the horses when I carry her to the corral?" Penny smiled, her heart full at the sight of her husband cradling their daughter. "She's 3 months old, Hayes." "I think she's mostly fascinated by the movement." "No," Hayes insisted. "She knows quality horseflesh when she sees it. Don't you, little one?" He brushed a gentle finger over Mary's cheek, and she stirred in her sleep, making tiny sucking motions with her mouth. Their quiet domesticity was interrupted one May afternoon by the arrival of an unexpected visitor. Penny was hanging laundry while Mary napped in a basket nearby when she heard the sound of an approaching buggy. Shading her eyes against the spring sunshine, her heart skipped a beat when she recognized her father's carriage. Hayes was in town picking up supplies, leaving Penny to face her father alone. For a moment, she considered gathering Mary and retreating into the house, but pride stiffened her spine. This was her home, her family. She had nothing to be ashamed of. Josiah Miller pulled the buggy to a stop and climbed down, looking older and more careworn than Penny remembered. He approached slowly, his eyes moving from Penny to the basket where Mary slept. "Father," Penny acknowledged, her voice cool but steady. "Penelope," he returned, removing his hat. He stood awkwardly for a moment, then gestured toward the basket. "Is that your granddaughter?" Penny confirmed. "Mary Hayes Donovan." Something flickered across her father's stern face, longing, perhaps, or regret. "May I see her?" Penny hesitated, then nodded, moving the basket slightly so her father could look inside. Mary slept peacefully, one tiny fist curled beside her cheek, her auburn lashes casting shadows on her round cheeks. "She has your mother's coloring," Josiah observed quietly. "Yes," Penny agreed. A heavy silence fell between them. Finally, Josiah cleared his throat. "Your mother tells me you're married now." "I am," Penny said. "Hayes is a good man, a good husband and father." Her father's eyebrows rose slightly at the word father, but he made no comment on it. Instead, he said, "Your mother misses you. The house is too quiet without you." Penny recognized the statement for what it was, the closest thing to an apology she was likely to get from her proud father. "I've missed her too," she admitted. "She's welcome here anytime. As are you, if you can accept my family as it is." Josiah looked at his granddaughter again, then back at Penny. Something in his expression had softened. "I was wrong," he said abruptly. "To turn you out, it was not what your mother would have wanted." The simple admission, so unexpected, brought tears to Penny's eyes. "No," she agreed. "It wasn't. I can't change what's done," Josiah continued, seeming to choose his words carefully. "But perhaps we could start anew, as family should." Before Penny could respond, Mary woke with a small cry. Without thinking, Penny lifted her daughter and cradled her against her shoulder, soothing her with gentle pats. "She's beautiful," Josiah said, his voice rough with emotion. May I hold her?" The request, so tentative from a man who had always been so certain of his place in the world, melted something in Penny's heart. "Of course," she said, carefully transferring the baby to her father's arms. Josiah held his granddaughter with surprising ease, looking down into her face with wonder. "Hello, little one," he said softly. "I'm your grandfather." Mary stared up at him with solemn eyes, then broke into a gummy smile that transformed her face. Josiah's breath caught, and when he looked up at Penny, there were tears in his eyes. "She's a miracle," he said simply. "Yes," Penny agreed. "She is." The sound of hoofbeats announced Hayes's return. He rode into the yard, pulling up short when he saw Josiah. His expression hardened as he dismounted, moving quickly to Penny's side. "Mr. Miller," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Donovan," Josiah returned, equally formal. "I was just meeting my granddaughter." Hayes looked at Penny questioningly, and she gave him a small nod to indicate everything was all right. Some of the tension left his shoulders, but he remained watchful. "She's a fine child," Josiah said, handing Mary back to Penny. "You both should be proud." "We are," Hayes said, his arm going protectively around Penny's waist. Josiah cleared his throat again. "I came to invite all of you to Sunday dinner, if you're amenable." Penny looked up at Hayes, who studied her father for a long moment before turning to her. "It's your decision," he said quietly. Penny considered the olive branch her father was extending. It wasn't a full apology, but it was a beginning. "We'll come," she said finally. "Thank you for the invitation." Josiah nodded, settling his hat back on his head. "Your mother will be pleased," he said, and Penny thought she detected a hint of relief in his voice. 2 o'clock then, after he had gone, Hayes turned to Penny. "Are you sure about this?" Penny looked down at Mary, then back at her husband. "I think so," she said. "For Mary's sake, if nothing else. She deserves to know her family, all of her family." Hayes nodded, though he still looked concerned. "If he says one word to upset you, he won't," Penny assured him. "I think he's genuinely trying to make amends." Hayes pulled her and Mary into a gentle embrace. "As long as he understands that this is your home now, you and Mary belong with me." Penny rested her head against his chest, comforted by the steady beat of his heart. "We do," she agreed. "And nothing will ever change that." Sunday dinner at the Miller household was initially a strained affair, with conversation limited to safe topics like the weather and town gossip. Martha Miller fussed over Mary, clearly delighted to finally hold her grandchild, while Josiah and Hayes engaged in careful, polite discourse about ranching. Gradually, however, the atmosphere warmed. By the time dessert was served, Martha was regaling Hayes with stories of Penny's childhood, making her daughter blush and her husband grin appreciatively. Even Josiah unbent enough to offer Hayes a glass of his prized whiskey, and the two men discovered a shared interest in breeding quality horses. By the end of the evening, tentative plans had been made for Josiah to visit the ranch to see Hayes's stock. As they prepared to leave, Martha pressed a package into Penny's hands. "Some of your old things," she explained, "and a few new bits and pieces for Mary." Josiah stepped forward, awkwardly patting Mary's head where she slept in Hayes's arms. "You'll come again," he said, not quite a question. "We will," Penny promised, impulsively kissing her father's cheek. A flush of pleased surprise colored his weathered face. On the ride home, Mary sleeping soundly in a basket between them, Hayes reached over to take Penny's hand. "That went better than expected," he observed. "It did," Penny agreed. "I think he's truly trying." "Good," Hayes said firmly. "Because you deserve a father who appreciates what an extraordinary woman his daughter is." Penny squeezed his hand, her heart full. "I already have a man who appreciates me," she said softly. Hayes brought her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her palm. "Always," he promised. The years that followed brought changes, both expected and surprising. Hayes expanded the ranch, adding more cattle and horses until the Donovan brand became known throughout the territory for quality stock. Penny planted a large garden and orchard, selling excess produce and preserves in town. Mary grew into a lively, curious child with her mother's auburn hair and her father's blue-gray eyes. Hayes taught her to ride almost before she could walk, just as he'd promised, and by age 5 she could handle a gentle pony with confidence that astonished visitors. 2 years after Mary's birth, Penny gave Hayes a son, Henry James Donovan, born on a clear autumn night with Dr. Ferguson in attendance this time. Hayes held his son with trembling hands, overwhelmed by the knowledge that this child carried his blood. "He has your eyes," Penny said softly, watching her husband cradle their newborn. "And your spirit, I'd wager," Hayes replied, gently touching the downy dark hair on the baby's head. "Poor boy won't stand a chance with you and Mary to contend with." Penny laughed, exhausted but radiantly happy. "Don't forget my father. He'll spoil this one even worse than he does Mary." It was true. Over time, Josiah Miller had softened considerably toward his grandchildren. Mary, in particular, had him wrapped around her little finger, and the stern merchant who had once cast out his own daughter could often be found on his hands and knees, playing horses with the delighted child. The reconciliation with her family healed something in Penny that she hadn't realized was still broken. While she never forgot the pain of that night when her father had turned her away, she came to understand that forgiveness, freely given, benefited the giver as much as the recipient. One summer evening, as they sat on the porch watching Mary and 3-year-old Henry chase fireflies in the gathering dusk, Hayes put his arm around Penny's shoulders. "Did I ever tell you," he asked quietly, "about that first night you came here?" Penny leaned into him, enjoying the solid warmth of his body against hers. "What about it?" "I almost didn't answer the door," he admitted. "I'd had a bad day, lost a colt I'd been hoping to train, and wasn't in any mood for company." "What changed your mind?" Penny asked. Hayes was silent for a moment, watching their children's antics. "Something told me to open that door," he said finally. "Call it instinct or maybe providence, but I knew somehow that whatever was on the other side of that door was important." Penny turned her face up to his, her heart still quickening at the love she saw in his eyes. "I'm glad you listened to that instinct. Best decision I ever made," Hayes said, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Opening my door to you." As darkness fell fully, and the children tired of their game, Hayes and Penny called them in for bedtime. There were protests, of course, and negotiations for just one more story before the lamps were extinguished. Finally, with both children tucked safely in their beds, Penny and Hayes returned to the porch, savoring the quiet moments before their own rest. The stars blazed overhead in the clear Wyoming sky, countless points of light illuminating the vastness above. Hayes pulled Penny close, and she rested her head on his shoulder, content in a way she once would never have thought possible. "I love you, Penny Donovan," Hayes murmured against her hair. "Every day I thank God for bringing you to my door." "And I love you," Penny replied, thinking of the long, winding path that had led her here, the mistakes and heartaches, the courage and second chances. "For opening it when I knocked." In the distance, a coyote called, its lonely cry echoing across the open land. But on the porch of the Donovan ranch, there was no loneliness, only the quiet certainty of two people who had found, against all odds, exactly where they belonged.